Rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, turning the excavation site into a churning pit of mud and despair. For 3 months, the Royal Historical Society had dug into the flinty hillside. Finding little more than pottery shards and the bones of common beasts, funding was drying up. Morale was lower than the trench lines. Master historian Alaric Thorne stood at the edge of the mire, his fine robes spattered with filth, watching his life's work dissolve into the sludge. Then, the iron song of a shovel striking something that was not stone rang out clear. A dissonant chime that silenced the cursing of the workers. A young apprentice, Kalen, stared into the black gash he'd opened, his face pale in the gray light. Alaric was at his side in moments, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "Clear it, gently, you elves, gently." His voice was a hoarse command. They used hands and brushes, the rain washing away centuries of compacted earth. What emerged was not a rock, nor a mundane slab. It was a spire, a fragment of a towering structure, crafted from a stone that seemed to devour the weak daylight. It was black, but not a mere absence of color. It was the black of a starless midnight, veined with capillaries of silver that pulsed with a faint internal luminescence where the water touched them. The glyphs came next. As more mud sloughed away, intricate carvings were revealed. They were angular, severe, and utterly alien. They spoke of a geometry that hurt the eyes, lines intersecting at impossible angles, suggesting a language not of sound, but of shadow and concept. This was no elven script of flowing vines, nor dwarven runes of solidity and craft. This was something older, something that whispered of depths. Alaric's scholarly awe curdled into foreboding when they found the first body. It was not a skeleton laid to rest. A worker's brush exposed a skeletal hand, fingers curled like claws, tangled in the roots of an ancient petrified tree that had grown around the spire's base. The bones were unnaturally dark, stained the same deep ebony as the spire itself, and they were not alone. More followed, a scattered ring of them, as if they had fallen in a final, desperate struggle to defend the structure or to flee from it. The drama turned to blood with the last discovery of the day. As the light failed, Kalen, driven by a youth's reckless curiosity, pressed his hand against a central glyph to trace its shape. The silver veins in the stone flared, a cold magnesium-bright light searing the eyes of onlookers. A soundless shriek seemed to vibrate from the stone itself. Then, from invisible pores in the obsidian surface, a black, viscous liquid seeped out. It moved with purpose. It slid over Kellen's hand before he could jerk away. Where it touched, his skin smoked. He screamed, a raw sound torn from his throat as the substance clung and crawled, etching the same alien glyphs into his flesh, burning them into his wrist and forearm. The smell of seared meat and ozone filled the air. 2 burly laborers rushed forward, dragging the shrieking apprentice back. They used a pickaxe to scrape the horrid substance away, taking strips of skin and muscle with it. The black liquid, now mixed with Kellen's blood, dripped back onto the spire and was absorbed without a trace. In the sudden, panting silence, broken only by Kellen's whimpers and the eternal rain, Alaric stared. The apprentice's ravaged arm bore a now permanent, angry scar in the exact shape of the spire's central glyph. And on the stone, where the blood had been drunk, the silver veins glowed brighter, casting long, twisted shadows that looked less like projections of light and more like reaching fingers. The lost race was no longer a myth. It was a corpse, buried and waiting. And in unearthing its spire, they had not simply discovered history. They had pricked a sleeping horror with a shovel. And now, in the cold mud and the hot, coppery scent of blood, it had begun to bleed back. The grand archives of the Royal Historical Society were a sanctuary of dust and silence, a fortress against the chaos of the present. But the silence that greeted Master Historian Alaric Thorne upon his return was different. It was a watchful, pregnant hush, broken only by the frantic scratching of his own pen and the low, pained moans from the cot in the corner. Kalen thrashed in a fevered sleep, his bandaged arm, now branded with the alien glyph, twitching as if the lines were worms burrowing deeper. The Society's physicians were baffled. The wound refused to heal cleanly, weeping a thin, silver-flecked pus that smelled of damp stone and ozone. Each night, the apprentice muttered in a tongue that crackled like static, his voice not his own. Alaric had brought the contagion of the spire back with him, not in his body but in his notes. Sketches of the glyphs covered every available surface of his secluded scriptorium. The angular predatory shapes seemed to shift in the candlelight, their meanings slithering just beyond comprehension. He had spent days cross-referencing every known lexicon, every heresy, every forbidden folio on pre-cataclysm civilizations. He found nothing. The spire's language was a key for which there was no lock, a question that erased all existing answers. The whispers began on the third night. It started as a pressure in the air, a vibration so deep it was felt in the teeth rather than heard. Then came the sound of susurration, like dry leaves skittering across stone, emanating from the very parchments themselves. Alaric would look up from a tome on ancient high elven migrations to see the sketched glyphs on a nearby parchment seem to deepen, their lines drinking the candlelight. The whispers coiled into his ears, not with words, but with intent. A cold, vast loneliness, a thirst older than mountains, a rage that had cooled into something patient and infinitely cruel. He began to dream while awake. Flashes of a city not of spires, but of negative space-towering absences carved into a cavern's endless night. He felt the memory of a sun so hated its light was a physical scourge. The whispers promised knowledge, but it was a knowledge that bled. It spoke of a great severing, a weeping veil drawn across the world, and of a silence that was not peace, but a tomb. The archives themselves began to rebel. A young librarian, tasked with retrieving a mundane scroll on irrigation techniques from a shelf near Alaric's notes, was found at dawn. She lay in a pool of ink she had smashed, using her own blood as a thinner to scrawl a frantic, imperfect copy of the spire's central glyph across the marble floor. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, her fingertips raw and bloody. She whispered of the music in the stone before collapsing into a catatonic state. Then the blood truly began to flow. The Society's head archivist, stern man who had dismissed Alaric's superstitious findings, decided to burn the contaminated sketches. He gathered them in a brass brazier in the central atrium. The moment the flame touched the first parchment, a shriek tore through the hall, a sound that seemed to come from the stone vaults above. Every candle and lantern flared, then died, plunging the room into a blackness that felt solid. In that darkness, things moved. There were wet, tearing sounds, and the archivist's choked gurgles. When the lanterns were relit with trembling hands, the man was dead. His body lay twisted, his own ceremonial dagger plunged into his heart, a heart that had been carved out with surgical precision and placed upon the unburned sketches. The glyphs on the papers now glistened, freshly inked in arterial red. No one saw what had happened, but everyone felt the aftermath, a new focused attention in the whispers, a predatory interest now centered on Alaric. The knowledge he sought was not dead history, it was a sleeping beast, and his inquiries were strokes along its hide, stirring it toward wakefulness. The whispers were no longer just in the archives. They were in the drip of water in the cistern, in the groan of the old wood, in the spaces between heartbeats. They were an invitation or a warning, written not in ink or blood, but in the growing terror of a man who had opened a door and could no longer close it. The Royal Historical Society sealed Master Historian Alaric Thorne's scriptorium with a decree of quarantine, but it was a gesture of profound futility. The true quarantine was internal, a prison of his own making, its walls built from glyphs, and its bars forged from whispers. The outside world, the concerned faces of colleagues, the distant cries of the city, had faded to a faint, irrelevant murmur. The only reality was the one etched in dark stone and darker blood. Alaric had moved the branded apprentice, Kalen, into his own cramped chambers. The boy was a living text now, a flesh-hand-blood lexicon of the spire's curse. The glyph on his forearm had stopped festering and had instead hardened into a raised keloid scar of startling clarity. It pulsed, not with light, but with a coldness that seeped into the air around it. Kalen no longer moaned. He sat in silence, staring at walls with eyes that held swirling galaxies of silver flecks. He would, at precise intervals, dip a finger into a bowl of broth and trace the same glyph on the floorboards over and over until his fingertip bled. Alaric observed it all, recording every tremor, every repetition, in a new ledger. His own notes, the ones that had caused the death in the archives, were useless. He understood that now. They were surface scratches. True translation required a deeper, more intimate sacrifice. It required not just study, but symbiosis. He began with his own body, a scholar's grim experiment. Using a sterile lancet meant for archival repairs, he pricked his fingertip and carefully, painstakingly, began redrawing the spire's central glyph on a clean vellum with his own blood. The moment the circle closed, a jolt of electric ice shot up his arm. The blood on the page darkened, blackened, and seemed to sink into the vellum as if drinking itself. A fresh, more coherent whisper slithered into his mind, not as sound, but as a direct implant of meaning. Threshold, key, the price of entry. The price. The whispers were clear. Ink was inert. Parchment was dead. To translate the living language of a lost race required a living medium. Blood was the ink. Flesh was the page. His obsession became a ritual. He moved from vellum to the skin of his own forearm, etching the glyphs with a fine silver needle. Using a mixture of his blood and the strange silver-flecked pus from Kellen's wound as pigment, each glyph carved was a wave of nausea, a vertigo of alien memory, a flash of soaring through starless caverns, taste of phosphorescent fungus, the resonant song of a subterranean city. But with each, the whispers coalesced into something sharper, more directive. They spoke of a journey, a veil of mist that cloaked the path, and a first glyph that was not a symbol, but a place of origin. The drama escalated from self-mutilation to a terrifying transference. Alaric, in a fugue state, found himself standing over Kalen. The boy looked up, his silver-swirled eyes meeting Alaric's for the first time in weeks. A single, coherent word fell from Kellen's cracked lips. More. With a chilling synchronicity, the brand on Kellen's arm flared with that same cold, black light. The stacked ledgers in the room trembled. The half-finished glyph on Alaric's own arm burned as if seared with a brand. And from Kellen's eyes, from his nose, thin tendrils of darkness, like living smoke, began to weep. They did not dissipate. They coiled across the floor, seeking the blood-inscribed glyphs on Alaric's skin, on the floor, on the walls. Alaric stumbled back, a raw cry of both terror and triumph caught in his throat. This was not possession, it was communion. Kalen was a conduit, a vessel slowly filling with the essence of the spire, and he was beginning to overflow. The blood came not from violence, but from completion. As the tendrils of shadow from Kalen touched Alaric's self-made glyphs, every carved line on the scholar's arm split open simultaneously. Blood, dark and far too cold, welled up in perfect rivulets, tracing the patterns with gruesome precision. It did not drip, clung, beating like black mercury, a perfect, horrific mirror of the silvery veins in the unearthed spire. In that moment of agonizing clarity, Alaric understood. He was not just translating the language, he was being rewritten by it. His own biology, his very blood, was being reconfigured into a living map. The whispers were now a single commanding voice in the center of his skull. It showed him a path through mountains wreathed in perpetual mist, to a cleft in the world where the shadows were oldest. The obsession was over. It had been satisfied. What remained was not a scholar, but a pilgrim. Alaric looked at his blood-scribed arm, at the catatonic boy leaking shadows, and knew with chilling certainty what he had to do. The answers were not in any archive. They were in the mist at the origin point. He would go to the place the glyphs called home. He would find the veil, and he would step beyond it. The blood was the key, and he had, at last, begun to turn it. The mountain pass was not on any map Alaric Thorn possessed. It existed in the negative space between known peaks. A scar in the world's flesh described only by the blood glyphs now permanently etched into his arm. They acted as a compass, the lines throbbing with a dull, icy ache that intensified with every wrong turn and faded when he chose the correct ever-narrowing path. He was a man following the pull of his own infected veins. Kalen walked beside him, a silent, ghastly pilgrim. The boy needed no guidance, his feet finding the invisible trail with an instinct that was no longer his own. The silver flecks in his eyes had multiplied, nearly drowning the original brown. A faint, shadowy vapor, like the ghost of breath on a freezing day. Now continually seeped from his pores, making him shimmer in the mountain light, a figure of living twilight. For 7 days they climbed, leaving the world of green and sun behind. The air grew thin and bitter, while the sky, when visible, was a sheet of hammered iron. Then they found the veil. It was not mist. It was a solid wall of swirling opalescent gray that filled a sheer canyon from floor to impossible height. It did not move with the wind. It churned with a slow internal rhythm, like a liquid trapped in glass. Light died upon its surface. Sound was swallowed whole. The blood glyphs on Alaric's arm blazed with pain, every line feeling fresh cut. This was the barrier, the weeping veil, the memory of a cataclysm made permanent. There was an archway. It was formed of the same black silver-veined stone as the buried spire, a testament that this path was not natural, but made. And it was guarded. Before the arch, fused into the living rock in poses of eternal agony, were 3 figures. Their flesh had long since petrified into a substance like coal, but their forms were unmistakably elven, though taller, thinner, with elongated limbs and elegant, cruel features locked in final screams. They were not mere statues. Their chests, their hearts still hung, suspended in cages of crystal that glowed with a sickly amber light. With each slow beat of those crystal-encased hearts, a fresh rivulet of black, tar-like blood oozed from the stone at their feet, seeping toward the veil, only to be absorbed into its shifting depths. Sentinel punishments. The meaning slammed into Alaric's mind, a gift from the whispers. Traitors to the lost race, bound forever to bleed and feed the barrier they had tried to breach. To pass, the veil demanded a toll. Not of coin or word, but of essence. The archway's threshold was a channel, and it ran with a thin, constant stream of the same black sentinel blood. The message was clear. Only that which belonged to the dark could pass. Alaric looked at his own arm, at the raised, scarred lines. He looked at Kaelin, whose shadow vapor now streamed toward the veil as if drawn by a tide. There was no other path. We stepped into the archway. The moment his boot touched the blackened channel, the world erupted. The sentinel hearts pulsed violently. The stream of ancient blood ignited, not with heat, but with a voracious kinetic hunger. It leaped from the channel, not as a liquid, but as a swarm of razor-edged filaments. They lashed at Alaric's legs, slicing through leather and wool, seeking the fresh, living blood beneath. He screamed as the filaments burrowed, not just cutting but drinking. He could feel the pull, a dreadful suction drawing his vitality down into the stone. Next to him, Kaelin made no sound. The filaments recoiled from his shadow-wreathed form, repelled. He was already more their kind than human. Alaric was being drained, judged, and found wanting. In a final desperate act, he slammed his blood-glyphed forearm against the archway's stone. He pressed the open, weeping wounds of his self-made inscriptions directly onto the black rock. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The glyphs on his arm flared with a cold black light. The silver veins in the archway stone responded in kind, lighting up like circuitry. The filaments withdrew from his legs. Instead, the archway began to drink directly from the glyphs. Pulling the blood, his blood now irrevocably altered by obsession and communion, from his very body. It was a transfusion across millennia. As his strength ebbed, his vision darkening at the edges, the opalescent veil before him shuddered. A rift tore open in its fabric, not wide, but deep, a tunnel of howling, nullifying gray. He had paid the price in his own rewritten blood. The path was open, stumbling nearly empty. Alaric fell forward through the rift, Kaelin gliding silently behind him. The veil sealed instantly at their backs, seamless and silent. On the other side, the world was gone. The sun, the sky, the very concept of up and down, all were erased. He lay on cold, smooth stone, gasping, his body a map of pain. Before him, under a sky of endless, perfect black, studded with faint, fungal bioluminescence, stretched the impossible skyline of a cavern so vast its edges were lost in darkness. And there, at the city's distant heart, looming taller than any mountain he had just crossed, was the source of the first glyph. The lost race had not built a city. They had grown one from the bones of the world, and he was now, irrevocably, in its silent, waiting throat. The silence of the cavern city was not an absence, but a presence, a dense, watchful stillness that pressed against Alaric's eardrums like deep water. The air was cold, smelling of ozone, damp stone, and something else. A lingering metallic temps, like old blood on iron. The fungal light, a soft violet and bruised blue, clung to the curves of impossible architecture, revealing avenues that spiraled into the abyss below and towers that twisted up to vanish in the cavern's sooty ceiling. It was a geometry of deliberate madness, a place where the very stones seemed to have flowed like liquid before freezing into agonized, beautiful forms. But all of it, every twisted spire and sunless plaza, was oriented toward one central fact. It was not a building. It was a mountain of the same black, silver-veined stone, rising from the city's heart like a jagged black tooth. Carved into its sheer face, covering miles of its surface, was the first glyph. From a distance, it had looked like a pattern. Up close, it was a world. The single, repeating symbol, the root of all the script that had infected Alaric, was not merely etched. It was channeled, a gargantuan trough carved into the mountainside, deep enough to swallow castles. And it was not empty. It was full to the brim with a substance that held the faint light in a grip of absolute black, shadow made liquid, or blood grown old and cosmic. This was the source, the wellspring. The whispering in the archives, the sentinel's curse at the veil, the compulsion in his own blood, all of it flowed from this. The first glyph was a scar, and the city had been built to worship the infection. Kalen moved ahead, no longer walking but drifting, his feet an inch above the smooth obsidian pavement. The shadow vapor pouring from him streamed toward the glyph mountain like smoke drawn to a cold fire. He was going home. Alaric followed, his own blood-glyphed arm trembling, not with pain now, but with a terrible gravitational pull. Each step was heavier, as if the black substance in the trough was a magnet for the darkness in his veins. The whispers had coalesced into a single, resonant tone here, a deep hum that vibrated in his marrow, a wordless song of endings. As they reached the base of the mountain, Alaric saw the feeders. Stone conduits, elegant and ghastly, ran from the base of the great trough down into the city's foundations. Once, perhaps, this had been a system of terrible purpose. Now, they were dry and silent. The city was starved. Kalen stopped at the edge of a vast circular plaza that lay directly before the mountain. In its center was a plinth, and upon the plinth rested a single tool, a dagger of pure, crystalline obsidian, its edge glowing with a faint silver radiance. It was not meant for war. It was a ritual instrument. The meaning unfolded in Alaric's mind, not as a whisper, but as a deafening command. The first shadow must be fed. The well must be filled to wake the city. The glyphs are the key, but blood is the turn. This was the final test of translation. He had read the language in stone and in his own flesh. Now he must speak it in the only dialect it truly understood. Sacrifice. Kalen turned to look at him. The boy's face was serene, empty of all human thought. His silver-swirled eyes reflected the towering glyph. He extended his branded arm, the scar pulsing softly. He was the offering, prepared and willing. The vessel awaited the ritual. A violent human revulsion surged in Alaric, a last gasp of the man he had been. This was not scholarship, this was murder. But the glyphs on his arm ignited with icy fire, and the revulsion was burned away, placed by a crushing, logical necessity. This was the next sentence in the text. To stop now was to render the previous chapters meaningless, to make his own mutilation and the deaths of others mere vandalism. To understand, he must complete the verse. His hand, moving with a will that was both his and not his, closed around the hilt of the obsidian dagger. The crystal was freezing, singing a high, keen note that matched the deep hum of the mountain. He stepped toward Kalen. He raised the dagger. The glyph on Kellen's arm blazed in response, as if welcoming its own end. Alaric did not strike at the heart. The ritual was more specific. He placed the dagger's point against the center of the branded glyph. With a smooth, terrible pressure, he pushed. The crystalline edge met no resistance from flesh, parted skin, muscle, and bone as if they were mist. Kalen did not cry out. He sighed, a sound of profound release. A light, not silver, but deepest black, erupted from the wound. But it was not blood that flowed. It was liquid shadow, the same substance that filled the great trough above. It poured from Kalen in a torrent, far more than a human body could possibly contain. The shadow blood hit the plinth, cascaded down its sides, and followed the ancient channels in the plaza floor. It raced toward the dry stone feeders. With a sound like a mountain sighing, the feeders drank. The shadow blood surged upward through the conduits, a reverse waterfall flowing toward the mountainous glyph. Above, the great trough began to glow. The stagnant black substance within stirred, swirled, and deepened. The very apex of the glyph, where the symbol originated, a single drop of fresh, potent blackness coalesced and fell. It struck the surface below with a peal like a cracked bell. A shockwave of tangible darkness rippled out through the stone, through the air, through Alaric's very soul. In its wake, the faint fungal lights in the city winked out, one by one, consumed by a spreading, awakening gloom. The first shadow had been fed. In the new and absolute darkness, Alaric heard it, not a whisper, a breath. One single, drawn-in breath from 1,000 throats, echoing from the silent towers all around him. The city was no longer empty. It was holding its breath. And in the perfect black, the obsidian dagger, now cold and inert in his hand, was the only thing he could feel. It was the period at the end of the sentence he had just written in a boy's lifeblood. The next chapter belonged to the race he had just begun to rouse. The darkness after the sacrifice was absolute, a weight upon the eyes and the soul. The silence that followed the city's single, indrawn breath was worse. It was a listening silence. Alaric stood alone in the plaza, the obsidian dagger slipping from his blood-slick fingers to clatter on the stone. Before him, where Kalen had stood, was only a faint pile of greasy ash. The final shape of the boy's body etched in powder before a whisper of stale air scattered it into nothingness. The sacrifice had been accepted. The city was awake. It began with light. Not the soft fungal glow, but the silver veins in the black stone of the towers and streets. They ignited one by one. A creeping network of cold electricity spreading from the base of the glyph mountain, out into the cavern's endless sprawl. The city revealed itself in stark, severe lines of silver on black, a negative image of a world, beautiful and terrifying. And with the light came the echoes. At first they were just sounds, the ghost of footsteps on a distant bridge, the rustle of fabric from an empty balcony, the faint chime of glass from a tower with no windows. But as the silver light pulsed, the echoes gained dimension. Alaric saw them. Figures of condensed shadow and memory, shimmering in and out of solidity. A procession of tall, elegant forms glided down the central avenue, their outlines crisp, their features smooth plains of darkness. They were the afterimage of the Dark Elves, the psychic residue of a civilization imprinted on the stone by millennia of collective presence and sudden, catastrophic silence. He was not alone. He was surrounded by a city of ghosts going about their final day. Driven by a scholar's crumbling instinct, Alaric stumbled from the plaza into a grand vaulted hall. Silver light traced archways that seemed to grow from the floor like petrified vines. The echoes here were more vivid. He saw figures seated at long, low tables, their slender hands lifting cups that were only hollow darkness to toast with silent laughter. He saw two figures locked in a fierce debate, their gestures sharp and urgent, the sound of their argument just a breath of static. But the drama of the past was underscored by the visceral horror of the present. The city was not merely haunted, it was preserved. In side chambers, he found the physical remains. They were not skeletons, but desiccated figures, skin like dark leather stretched over sharp bone, still seated in chairs of stone or slumped over arcane instruments. They had not decayed. They had been desiccated by time in this sterile, sunless tomb. Their eyes were gone, but their mouths were often open in what could have been song or scream. The blood came not from these mummies, but from the echoes themselves. As Alaric moved deeper, drawn toward a central, throbbing source of silver light, the phantoms began to notice him. Sentry Echo turned its featureless face toward him. With a gesture as casual as pointing the way, it mimed throwing a spear. A searing line of pain opened across Alaric's thigh. He cried out, stumbling, his hand coming away wet with his own very real blood. The echo weapon had been illusion, but the intent behind it, solidified by the city's reawakening power, was lethally tangible. He was being tested, or perhaps punished, by the memories of the dead. He limped onward, leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the flawless stone. The echoes grew denser, their actions more frantic. He saw them looking upward, their postures rigid with fear or defiance. He saw others hunched over glowing sigils on the floor, their movements desperate. The air grew colder. The silver light began to strobe, flashing with each beat of a distant deep pulse, the pulse of the glyph mountain. He reached the heart of the hall. There on a dais sat an echo more solid than the others. It was a regal figure, head bowed, long fingers steepled. Before it, floating in the air, was a single, perfect sphere of black crystal, within which swirls of silver and red fought like trapped storms. As Alaric approached, the figure raised its head. It had no face, only a smooth oval of deeper shadow, but Alaric felt its regard like a physical pressure. The echo did not speak. It simply extended a hand toward the sphere. In the crystal, the red swirls coalesced into an image, the world above, sun-drenched in green, seen from a great height. Then the image shattered under a wave of conquering silver light. The echo's hand then swept outward, indicating the city, the preserved dead, the frantic phantoms. The gesture was one of profound, catastrophic loss. This was no mere memory. This was a recording, a verdict. The story of a people who had looked upon the sun and found it wanting, who had crafted a glorious darkness, and who had been erased by a power even they could not control. The regal echo clenched its outstretched hand into a fist. All around Alaric, the other echoes froze. Then, as one, they turned toward him. Every blank, shadowed face fixed upon the living, bleeding man in their midst. The silent plea in the air transformed into a single, unified demand. Remember us. Know our end, or you will repeat it. The pressure of their collective will was a spike of ice driven into Alaric's mind. Blood trickled from his nose, hot and sudden. He fell to his knees, not in worship, but under the immense weight of a history written not in ink, but in extinction. The city of silent echoes did not whisper. It screamed its silence directly into his soul, and the sound was breaking him. The silent scream of the city's echo chorus pressed Alaric into the stone floor of the hall. It was not a sound, but a force, compressing his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs in a pained gasp. Blood from his nose and wounded leg pooled beneath him, a small, warm island in the cavern's chill. The silver light of the veins strobing overhead matched the frantic rhythm of his own heartbeat. He was drowning in their collective memory of annihilation. Just as the pressure threatened to shatter his mind, it vanished. The echoes froze, then dissolved like smoke in a sudden unfelt wind. The hall was empty, save for the desiccated remains and the oppressive hum of the city. The silence that followed was pointed, deliberate. Path had been cleared. The silver light in the stone veins flowed like liquid mercury, streaming away from the hall and down a narrow descending corridor Alaric had not noticed before. It was an invitation, or a summons. There was no choice but to follow. He pushed himself up, the wound on his thigh pulling tight and fresh blood soaking his torn trousers, and limped into the passage. The air grew colder, drier. The corridor wound down in a tight spiral deep into the city's roots. The walls here were not carved, but smooth, almost organic, as if the stone had been worn away by a single, endless purpose. The silver light gathered at the corridor's end, pooling around a solitary, massive door. It was not stone, but a single slab of black crystal, opaque and depthless. As Alaric approached, the blood from his injuries, dripping steadily now, spattered onto the threshold. Where each drop struck, the black crystal drank it, and a single, complex glyph flared red on its surface for an instant before fading. A lock, recognizing the key. With a sigh of millennia-displaced air, the door slid sideways into the wall, revealing a chamber that stole what little breath he had left. It was the archive, not of parchment, but of flesh. The circular room was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, and covering every inch of the curved walls, from floor to unseen ceiling, were faces. Not carvings, actual faces, preserved in the same state of leathery desiccation as the bodies in the hall above, but here they had been fused seamlessly into the black stone. thousands upon thousands of them, eyes closed, expressions serene or sorrowful or stern. Each face was unique, a captured moment of a life. A soft silver luminescence pulsed within the stone behind them, passing through each one like a slow, cold heartbeat. In the center of the room, connected to the walls by strands of crystalline nerve threads that glowed with the same pulsing light, sat the keeper. It was alive. Its body was a fused mass of the same black stone and withered tissue, seated upon a throne of intertwining roots. It was genderless, ageless, more monument than being. But its face, a single, gaunt face atop the column of its body, was animate. Its eyes were open, two pools of liquid silver that held swirling constellations of minute dying stars. Its long, thin hands, resting on the arms of the throne, were stained a permanent, rusty brown. As Alaric entered, those cosmic eyes focused on him. The keeper's head tilted with the sound of grinding pebbles. A voice, not a whisper, but a direct vibration in the marrow of Alaric's bones, spoke. "You have fed the first shadow. You have heard the silence. Now you will know the names." One of the keeper's hands lifted, a slow, monumental effort. It gestured to the wall of faces. As it did, the silver light behind one of them, a face with a proud, sharp brow and a mouth set in a line of determination, flared. A strand of light shot from the wall to Alaric's forehead. He did not see a history. He lived it. Burst of sensory memory. The scent of cold moss, the weight of a spear of polished bone. Oh, the fierce love for a deep-clad hunter. The taste of a subterranean spring. The name came with it, Varen of the Deep Glade. Then the memory curdled. Searing light, not silver but gold, burning from within. Scream trapped in a closing throat. Dust. The keeper's hand moved. Another face lit up. Lyra of the Silent Song. The memory, a voice that could shape crystals. A child's laugh echoing in a crystal garden, then a sudden silent emptiness. The song cut off mid-note. The child falling to dust in her arms, again and again. A soldier, a crafter, a philosopher. Each flash was a life, vibrant and full, extinguished in the same instant of terrifying, inward-turning light. Each ending was a spike of psychic trauma, a death experienced in a microsecond. Alaric gasped, clutching his head. Blood began to seep from his ears, from the corners of his eyes, thin trails of red cutting through the grime on his face. The weight of the names, the sheer volume of individual personal loss, was a physical assault. "This is the price of knowing," the keeper's voice thrummed in his bones. "To remember a people is to die with them, one by one." The flood continued. Hundreds, thousands. The chamber swam in a haze of silver light and blood and dying echoes. Alaric was on his knees again, his body trembling, his mind fraying under the onslaught of genocide. He was becoming a living tomb, his own consciousness the grave for a perished race. Just as his own identity threatened to dissolve entirely into the sea of lost lives, the keeper stopped. The connection severed. The chamber was once again still, save for Alaric's ragged, wet breaths and the soft, eternal pulse of the wall of faces. The keeper's silver eyes bore into him. It extended one stained, bony finger, pointing not at the walls, but directly at Alaric's chest. "One name remains," the bone-deep voice intoned. "The name that was not lost, the name that fled, the name that must be spoken to know the ash." The keeper's meaning was clear. The collective tragedy was only the prelude. The history of the fall was incomplete. To understand the ash, he must find the one who escaped it, the heir to the silence, the survivor. The keeper's hand fell, its energy spent. The chamber's light dimmed. The invitation to leave was implicit. Alaric crawled, then staggered to his feet, his body a map of pain, his mind a cemetery of strangers. He was no longer just a scholar seeking knowledge. He was a vessel of mourning, and his quest had narrowed to a single, terrible goal: find the one who lived, and learn why they alone had been spared the history written in ash. The weight of 10,000 deaths clung to Alaric as he stumbled from the chamber of the keeper. His mind felt raw, flayed open. Each remembered life had been a grain of sand, and together they formed a desert inside his skull, a wasteland of extinguished potential. But the keeper's final command was a compass needle in that desert, pointing toward a deeper, more singular truth. Find the name that fled. The city's silver veins, which had pulsed with a steady rhythm, now flickered erratically, guiding him away from the inhabited, or once inhabited, districts toward a more isolated spire. This one did not twist elegantly toward the cavern ceiling. It was a jagged, broken thing, its top sheared off as if by a colossal blade. It stood apart, a monument to exile. The path to its base was not paved. The ground was covered in a thick, granular layer of gray-white dust that crunched underfoot. Ash. It rose in plumes with every step, coating his bloody legs, filling his nose with a dry, scentless chill. This was not the ash of fire. It was the residue of something far more complete. The spire's entrance was a jagged maw. Inside, the walls were not smooth, but scarred with frantic, gouged markings. Not the elegant glyphs, but crude, desperate scratches. The final messages of the doomed. The silver light here was weak, sickly, and there, in the center of the main chamber, was the source of the ash. It was a font, a basin carved from the same black stone, but it was filled to the brim with the fine gray powder. Above it, suspended on chains of crystal that had gone dark and dead, hung a complex instrument of silver and obsidian, a scribe's tool or a torturer's. It was tilted, forever pouring an invisible stream into the basin below. This was the ashwell, the record of the end. As Alaric approached, the glyphs on his arm, dormant since the sacrifice, began to burn with a fresh, acidic pain. They were reacting to the ash. He understood instinctively. History was not in the faces of the keeper. That was memory. True history, the factual, causal record, was here. In the final particulate remains, there was only one way to read it. With a trembling hand, he reached out and touched the surface of the ash. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sensory overload. He was no longer receiving curated memories of lives. He was thrust into the collective, final moments of the race. The vision was absolute. He saw the city in its full, terrifying glory. The silver light blazing, the dark elves moving through their luminous dark with serene power. He felt their magnificent arrogance, their belief that they had mastered the deep places, that they had traded the cursed sun for a perfect, crafted eternity. Then came the dissonance. A wrong note in the city's hum, a flicker in the silver veins. It began at the base of the glyph mountain, where he had fed Kellen's shadow to the trough. A contradiction. The dark elves had sought to purge all light, but their own power, the first shadow, was a paradox, a light that denied light. They had built their civilization on a flaw. The glyph mountain convulsed. The black substance within the great trough did not glow. It ignited. A silent silver-white explosion radiated outward from the mountain, not as fire, but as a wave of unmaking. It was not heat, but a devastating, purifying truth that unmade anything based on the foundational flaw. Where it touched the dark elves, they did not burn. They eroded. He saw it through 1,000 pairs of eyes at once, a sculptor watching her hands dissolve into swirling motes of gray, a leader on the dais turning to shout an order that became a cloud of dust on his tongue, a child reaching for a parent who was already a fading silhouette of ash. There was no pain. There was only instantaneous, total negation. A race being deleted from the bottom up, their complex biology, their profound magic, their very consciousness, all reduced to the same inert, neutral powder. The ash in the font was not from their bodies, it was from their souls. The violence of the vision was psychic carnage. Alaric's own body convulsed on the floor of the spire. His back arched, and a scream was torn from his throat, but it was drowned in the silent roar of the cataclysm in his mind. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, painting his vision red. A torrent of blood gushed from his nose, spattering onto the real ash at his fingertips, making a thick, clotted paste. He witnessed the city die in an instant. The silver light snuffed out. The echoes created in that final nanosecond of collective terror. The silence that followed deeper than any tomb. But the vision did not end there. As the wave of unmaking swept to the city's edges, he saw one figure. A solitary form, not at the center, but on the periphery, in this very broken spire. This one was different. Their form shimmered with a desperate golden light. A light not of the sun, but of something else. Something foreign and anathema to the dark elf's crafted darkness. As the silver wave hit, the golden light resisted. It was pushed, battered but not dissolved. The figure was hurled backward, not into ash, but through the stone of the spire wall, vanishing just as the structure sheared apart. The one who fled. The one who carried a spark of the very thing the Dark Elves had tried to eradicate. The vision shattered. Alaric collapsed forward, his face in the ash, his blood mixing with the dust of a perished race. He gasped, choking on the powder of history. He knew now their end was not an attack from outside. It was a built-in cascade failure, a psychic suicide triggered by their own foundational paradox. They had died of a flawed idea, and one of them, somehow tainted with a contrary power, had been ejected from the ruin, spat out by the dying city like a poison. Alaric pushed himself up, a creature of blood and ash. The drama of their extinction was over. The mystery had shifted. The question was no longer what happened to the lost race. It was what was the golden light, and where did its bearer fall? The history was written. Now he had to find the survivor who carried the blasphemous footnote to it all. The ash clung to Alaric like a second skin, a gritty shroud of extinguished history. His body was a tapestry of pain, the weeping slash on his leg, the psychic wounds from 10,000 deaths, the raw sockets of his eyes, blood-streaked and blurred. The revelation in the ash had not granted peace. It had forged a new, more urgent purpose. The survivor existed, the one with the golden light, the heir to the paradox. To find them, he had to understand the exile, not just the end. The path led him back, but not the way he had come. The city's silver veins, now pulsing in a slow, weak cadence like a failing heart, drew him toward the cavern's perimeter, to where the worked stone met the raw, weeping rock of the world. Here, the air was no longer still. A current moved, damp and cold, carrying a faint rhythmic sound, not a whisper, but a slow, resonant drip, like water falling into a vast well. It was the sound that had given the veil its name. The weeping veil was not a single barrier. That had been the outer gate he had breached with his blood. This was the source, the inner wound. Before him, the cavern wall was not solid. It was a cataract of solidified mist, the same opalescent gray as the outer veil. But here it flowed in a slow, eternal cascade from some unseen height far above, disappearing into a fissure in the floor below. It was not stone, not liquid, but something between, shimmering with trapped, ghostly luminescence. Within its depths, shapes moved, not echoes, but reflections of things that were, and things that might have been. It was a wall of solidified possibility, a monument to the Cataclysm's moment of choice. This was not a barrier the Dark Elves had built. This was a scar their death had torn in reality itself. To find the path of the exile, he had to read the veil. The knowledge came to him not as a whisper, but as a cold certainty in his gut. The blood glyphs on his arm, caked in ash, and his own dried blood began to itch fiercely. They were the key, but the lock was in the present, not the past. He needed a lens, a focus. He found it at the veil's edge. A triangular plinth of clear crystal, pointing like an accusing finger into the swirling gray. At its center was a shallow basin, empty, waiting. The meaning was undeniable, the veil recorded. Blood, the fluid of life and memory, would develop the image. It demanded a fresh sacrifice to show the old path. Alaric's own blood was thin, spent, diluted by trauma and exhaustion, was not enough. His gaze fell to the obsidian, ritual dagger, still tucked into his belt, its edge stained with Kellen's shadow essence. It was a tool of endings. It would serve. He approached the crystal plinth. With no ceremony left in him, only a grim and practical desperation, he placed his left hand flat over the basin. In his right, he took the dagger. He thought of the survivor, of the blasphemous golden light that had resisted the unmaking. He needed to see where they had gone. He drove the dagger's point through the back of his hand. The pain was a bright, shocking clarity. Blood, rich and red, welled instantly, flowing freely into the basin. It did not pool, but was siphoned down into the crystal, spreading through the plinth in a web of crimson fractals. The blood reached the tip, pointing at the veil. The opalescent gray reacted. It rippled, then stilled, becoming a vast, murky mirror. Images flickered within, chaotic and fast. The glorious city, the silent implosion of light, the rain of ash. Then it focused. It showed the broken spire, the moment of the cataclysm from the outside. Alaric saw the silver wave hit the spire. He saw a flash of desperate gold, like a dying ember spit from a fire. The figure, tall, elegant, clutching something to its chest, was hurled not just through stone, but through the very fabric of the cavern wall. The veil's surface became that wall, showed the figure passing into it, and as they did, the substance of the veil wept. Not water. Thin silvered trails of liquid light, like mercury mixed with tears, streaked from the point of impact, following the path of the exile. It was the world bleeding the memory of their passage. The vision within the veil began to track those tears, flowing upward, against gravity, along the cavern wall, toward a high, distant ledge. The path of the exile was a vertical scar of weeping stone, but the vision demanded more. The blood in the basin was nearly drained, the image fading. The veil began to churn again, returning to formless gray. To see the destination, he needed more life, more blood. Gritting his teeth, Alaric twisted the dagger in the wound. A fresh gush soaked his arm. He watched his own vitality drain into the crystal. The image clarified, sharpened. It followed the silver tears up to a ledge where a fissure, glowing with a faint residual gold, promised an exit to the world above. Then the vision showed something else, something had followed the exile. Not a person. A piece of the city's dying will. A shard of intent, shaped like a hunting shadow, flowing into the fissure in their wake. A guardian, or an assassin. The blood in the basin was gone. The image vanished. The veil returned to its mindless, weeping flow. Alaric wrenched the dagger free. Blood streamed from the ragged hole in his hand. He was lightheaded, the world tilting. But he had seen it. The path was a climb along a weeping wound in the world. A trail marked by the perpetual tears of a stone that remembered a blasphemer's flight. Staggering to the base of the cavern wall, he looked up. There, almost invisible, was the faint, glistening track. He would have to climb it one-handed, with his life dripping onto the rocks below. Following a trail of celestial grief to find the one who had carried light into the dark and been expelled for it. The weeping veil had shown him the way. Now it was his turn to bleed for it. The climb along the weeping veil was an ascent through agony. Every handhold was slick with the veil's cold, silvered tears. Every pull with his wounded hand sent fresh jolts of white-hot pain up his arm and brought a fresh welling of blood that diluted the celestial fluid, turning it a pale, ugly pink. His vision swam, a haze of exhaustion and blood loss. His world narrowed to the next grip, the next ledge, the faint, shimmering trail of grief he followed. He climbed for what felt like days, though time had lost all meaning in the deep dark. The city below became a distant, silent grid of silver pinpricks. The air grew thinner, colder. The sound of the weeping dampened, replaced by a new sound, a faint, rhythmic thrum. Like a massive, slow heartbeat coming from the living rock itself, was the pulse of the world's root, the deepest anchor of reality, and he was climbing toward it. He finally dragged himself onto the ledge the vision had shown. The fissure yawned before him, no longer glowing with gold, but with a faint, earthy bioluminescence from strange, pulsing fungi. This was not an exit to the sunlit world above. It was a lateral passage delving deeper into a different stratum of the underworld. The air here smelled of ozone and rich, wet soil. And there, just inside the fissure, was the proof of the covenant. It was a grotto, half-natural cave, half-carved sanctuary. Two symbols dominated the space, carved into opposite walls. On one side, the familiar angular glyph of the first shadow. But here it was rendered not in black stone, but in a wood that had petrified into glittering coal. On the other, a symbol Alaric had never seen but instinctively understood, a spiraling, radiant sunburst carved not from gold, but from a pale, luminous crystal that cast a soft, genuine warmth. It was the symbol of the Light Elves, the ancient surface-dwelling counterparts his people's histories mentioned only in myth. Between them, in the center of the grotto floor, was the Covenant's price. Two skeletons lay intertwined, not locked in combat, but in a fatal embrace. One was tall, slender, its bones darkened to ebony, a dark elf. The other's bones were a lustrous, sun-bleached white. Their hands were clasped, and from the center of their joined grip, a single thorned vine of night-black wood had grown, piercing both of their chests, weaving through their rib cages, fusing them together in death. It was a biological binding, a marriage sealed not in love, but in mutual annihilation. This was no treaty. It was a curse, promised that the two peoples, sun and shadow, would die together if they ever joined. A stone plinth stood at the head of this grim monument. On it lay a single object, a locket. One half was made of the same petrified shadow wood, the other of the warm sun crystal. It was closed, sealed with a minuscule, complex lock that seemed to be a fusion of both glyphs. Alaric's blood-glyphed arm trembled, not with pain now, but with a profound gravitational pull toward the locket. This was the artifact the exile had clutched to their chest in the vision, the object that had pulsed with the protective golden light. It was the physical manifestation of the Covenant, and the key to the survivor's identity. But the Covenant had a guardian, the hunting shadow from the vision. As Alaric stepped toward the plinth, the warmth from the sun crystal symbol flickered. From the pool of darkness behind the petrified wood glyph, a shape detached itself. It was not an echo. It was a creature of living shade, a two-dimensional silhouette given predatory form. It had the elegant outline of a dark elf, but its edges smoked and bled into the surrounding dark. In one hand, it held a blade of solidified silence. It moved without sound. It was the embodiment of the Covenant's brutal terms. Any who seek to unite the symbols, die. Alaric had no weapon but the obsidian dagger, still crusted with his own blood. As the shadow surged forward, he raised it in a pathetic guard. The shadow's blade passed through the dagger's physical form as if it were smoke and sliced a line of perfect, cold void across Alaric's chest. There was no blood, only a numbness that spread like frostbite, stealing his breath. He stumbled back, falling against the plinth. His blood, pouring from his wounded hand, smeared across its surface. The blood touched the fused lock of the locket. The reaction was instantaneous. The locket's two halves, sun and shadow, flared. A beam of warm gold and a beam of cold silver shot out, intersecting on the Shadow Guardian. The creature shrieked, a sound of tearing parchment, as the conflicting energies unraveled it, pulling its form apart into dissipating strands of darkness. The Covenant's own power, triggered by the blood of a living glyph-marked outsider, had turned on its guardian. The guardian dissolved. Silence rushed back into the grotto, broken only by Alaric's ragged gasps and the deep subterranean thrum. Weakly, his chest screaming with phantom cold, he reached out and took the locket. It was warm and cold at once, a paradox he could hold in his hand. His bloody fingers fumbled with the fused lock. With a click that seemed to echo in his soul, it opened. Inside, there were no portraits. Instead, on one half, a tiny, perfect carving of the shadow glyph. On the other, the sunburst. Between them, pressed into the metal, was a single, long, elegant hair. It was neither black nor gold, but a strand of pure, shimmering silver. The final, shocking truth dawned on him. The survivor, the exile, was not a dark elf who had stolen light. They were the child of both, the heir to a union that was forbidden by a death pact. Their very existence had been the blasphemy that destabilized the Dark Elves' perfect, isolated darkness. The golden light that saved them was not stolen. It was inherited. The heir was a half-breed, the living contradiction. And the locket, with its strand of silver hair, was not just a clue. It was a compass, and it was now warm in his palm, pulsing softly with a direction that led deeper still. Toward the source of the world thrum, toward the sacrifice at the world's root. The locket was a living compass in Alaric's ruined hand. Its warmth and chill pulsed in time with the deep, resonant thrum that now filled the very air, a vibration that passed through stone and bone alike. The silver strand of hair within seemed to point, tugging him away from the dead Covenant, down the fissure and into a realm of primordial earth. The path was no longer carved. It was a tunnel worn by seismic breath, its walls slick with mineral sweat and threaded with veins of raw crystal that pulsed with faint inner light. The air grew thick, hot and heavy, with the scent of ozone and deep fungal decay. The thrum was not a sound, but a pressure, growing until it felt like the mountain itself was breathing. Alaric followed it, a speck of pain and purpose drawn into the heart of the world. The tunnel opened abruptly, and he found himself on a ledge overlooking a sight that stripped the last remnants of scholarly detachment from his soul. This was the root. It was not a tree root, but the root of reality, a colossal, twisting convergence of ley lines, crystal veins and raw elemental power made manifest. It filled a cavern so vast, its ceiling was lost in swirling, energy-laden mist. The root itself was a tapestry of conflicting energies, veins of the dark elves, silver-black stone intertwined with strands of luminous gold, and the deep, verdant green of living rock. It was beautiful, and it was grievously wounded. At its base, where the energies knotted into a furious, chaotic nexus, was the sacrifice. A figure was suspended in the heart of the maelstrom, pinned by spears of conflicting power, silver, gold, and green, that transected their body, holding them aloft like a bug in a celestial web. It was the survivor, the heir. Their form was tall, elegant, bearing the sharp features of the dark elves. But their skin held a faint, pearlescent sheen, and their long hair was the exact silver of the strand in the locket. Their eyes were closed, their face a mask of eternal, silent agony. They were not dead. They were a living keystone. Their half-breed body, the only thing containing the catastrophic feedback loop between the sundered powers. The spears of energy were not killing them. They were using them as a conduit, bleeding the destabilizing conflict into their very being, where it was contained in a torturous equilibrium. Below them, the ground was stained not with blood, but with a slow, perpetual drip of solidified energy. Tears of crystal and drops of black obsidian that fell into a pool of shimmering, unstable potential. This was the price of their survival. They had not escaped. They had been anchored. Their existence had caused the flaw. Now their torment was containing it. The city's unmaking had been averted from spreading to the wider world only because the air had become the shock absorber for the cataclysm, taking the infinite strain into their finite flesh. Alaric understood now with horrifying clarity. The lost race had not merely perished. Their end had created a wound in the world, and this single, blameless soul was the bandage, suffering an eternity of crucifixion to keep it from bleeding out into reality. To free them would be to uncork the bottled cataclysm. To leave them was a sin beyond measure. As he stood, paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice, the locket in his hand grew burning hot and freezing cold. The conflicting energies in the cavern reacted. The spears of power flared. The heir's body convulsed, a silent scream twisting their features. From the wounds where the energy spears pierced them, a fresh trickle of liquid light and shadow dripped, mingling with the pool below. The drama was not over. The guardian shadow from the Covenant had been a sentry. The root itself had a defense mechanism. From the swirling mists around the periphery of the cavern, shapes began to coalesce. It's not echoes, not shadows, but wardens. Constructs a pure elemental fury. One was a being of jagged, dark crystal, another a figure of swirling, angry gold, a third of thorned, petrified wood. They were the pure, undiluted manifestations of the sundered powers, and they saw Alaric, with his blood glyphs and his paradoxical locket, as a contaminant, an anomaly to be excised. They moved toward him with lethal intent. The crystal warden raised a blade-like hand. A shard of dark rock shot from the wall, grazing Alaric's side, opening a deep gash. Blood, hot and shockingly red, sprayed onto the cavern floor. His blood, hitting the pool of solidified energy at the root's base, was the final catalyst. The pool ignited. A geyser of raw, conflicting power erupted, not at Alaric, but at the converging wardens. It was a tempest of light and dark, shredding their elemental forms, turning them back into chaotic, harmless mist. His blood, a living fluid containing the whispers of the dark elves and the vitality of the surface world, had momentarily confused the root's defenses, acting as a chaotic neutral. In the aftermath, silence returned, heavier than before. The air hung, still impaled, their agony renewed by the surge. Alaric clutched his bleeding side, staring up at them. The locket had done its job. It had led him to the truth. The heir was not to be found in some hidden refuge. They were here, suffering at the axis of all things. he had not found a person. He had found a pinned butterfly at the center of a perpetual storm. To touch them, to even attempt to pull one of those spears of power free, would be to invite a second, and likely final, unmaking. The sacrifice was ongoing. The air was the throne upon which no one could sit, and the root from which no new legacy could grow. Alaric's quest had reached its end, and its end was an impossible choice. Accept this eternal, silent torture as the necessary price for the world, or become the hand that triggers the apocalypse by offering mercy. Alaric's choice was not a choice at all, but a slow, dawning comprehension. To free the air was to unleash the bottled cataclysm. To leave them was to perpetuate an atrocity of cosmic scale. He stood, a bleeding, broken man, before a suffering godling, and knew there was no answer in the texts he had worshipped. The truth was a living creature in agony. The air stirred. It was not a movement of the body, still held fast by the spears of power. It was an opening of the eyes. Their gaze, downcast from the nexus of pain, found Alaric. Those eyes were neither the silver of the dark elves, nor the gold of the surface world, but a profound starless gray, holding within them the depth of the cavern and the memory of a sky they had never seen. The pain in them was not a plea. It was a simple, unvarnished fact. And in that gaze, Alaric saw the throne. It was not a physical seat. It was the nexus itself. The air was not pinned to the root. They were fused with it. The spears of power were not restraints, but conduits. The air was the living regulator, the conscious filter through which the chaotic energies of the sundered covenant bled, were processed, and were rendered inert. Their mind was the throne room, and upon it they bore the endless, screaming council of conflicting powers. Their forgotten throne was a seat of unimaginable torment. A communication passed, not in words, but in a flood of empathic understanding that hammered into Alaric's mind. It carried the heir's name, the last and most secret of the keeper's names, Ilara. It carried the memory of parents, a dark elf scholar of the first glyph, and a light elf explorer of the deep ways, who had sought to bridge the divide and were executed for it, their love leaving behind a single, hidden, secret child. It carried the moment of the cataclysm, when Ilara's latent hybrid nature had acted as a lightning rod for the cascading flaw, pulling the destructive feedback into herself, an instinctual act of preservation that had become an eternal prison. The understanding was a psychic torrent. Alaric fell to his knees, blood from his side, and his hand pooling beneath him. The visions were not passive, they were experienced. He felt the sear of the silver power, the scorch of the gold, the deep, splintering agony of the petrified wood. He felt Elara's endless, silent scream vibrating in his own teeth. This was the true knowledge. The history was not in the ash. It was in the living soul who had become the archive of the aftermath. The drama escalated from understanding to a terrible shared burden. As the empathic link held, the chaotic energies, momentarily calmed by Alaric's presence, sensed a new conduit, a new potential regulator, a fresh mind to share the throne. A spear of gold light, one of the smaller, peripheral energies lancing the cavern, twitched. With a sound like cracking crystal, it tore free from the rock and swung in a lazy, deadly arc. It did not aim for Alaric. It aimed for the space between him and Ilara, seeking to forge a new connection, to chain him to the throne as well. Alaric scrambled back, but the light was not physical. It was an intention made manifest. It grazed his shoulder. Where it touched, his flesh did not burn. It translucent. For a horrifying second, he could see the bones and veins beneath, illuminated in stark golden detail, as his very being was partially unmade. A scream was torn from him, a raw, primal sound that echoed in the vast chamber. The pain was beyond anything physical. It was existential, a preview of dissolution. Blood, now shimmering with flecks of intrusive light, poured from the translucent wound. This blood hitting the floor did not ignite the energies. Instead, it was absorbed, drawn toward Ilara. Their shared understanding had created a bridge, and now his life essence was being siphoned along it, not to harm, but to relieve. Ilara's expression shifted infinitesimally. The eternal agony softened by a fraction. Single tear, not of light or shadow, but of clear salt water, traced a path through the dust on their cheek. They were drinking his pain, using his fleeting mortality to dilute their infinite sentence. He was not being attacked. He was being asked to share the throne. For a moment, an hour, a day. To give the heir a fragment of respite, paid for in his own blood and sanity. Alaric, through the haze of pain, made his choice. He did not retreat further, leaned into the link. He focused on the locket in his hand, the symbol of the union that had caused and now contained all of this. And he pushed his consciousness back along the empathic bridge, not to take the pain away, but to witness it fully, to acknowledge it. He offered not his strength, but his recognition. He saw Alara not as a tool, a sacrifice, or an heir, but as a person, the last of their kind. The ruler of a ruined, silent kingdom, whose only subject was pain, and whose only decree was endurance. In that moment of pure, shared witness, the spears of power dimmed, a thrumming in the cavern softened to a murmur. The torrent of empathic overload ceased, leaving Alaric hollowed out and gasping, but the bridge remained, thin and fragile. He was not the heir, but he had become the witness. The first subject to kneel, bloodied and broken, before the forgotten throne and truly see the monarch upon it. And in seeing he had granted the only solace possible, he had proven they were not alone. The next step was not about sharing the burden, but about finding a way to end it. The path forward was no longer into the past, but into a terrible, necessary future, to awaken what slept below and confront the source of the flaw itself. The fragile bridge of shared witness held. Alaric remained on his knees, his blood now a strange, shimmering mixture of red and intrusive gold, still slowly feeding the empathic link to Alara. The cavern's furious thrum had softened to a pained murmur. The spears of power dimmed to a faint, trembling glow. The heir's starless gray eyes remained locked on his, a silent, fathomless well of gratitude and dread. For the first time in millennia, their solitude had been broken. For the first time, another mind had touched the throne of agony and not shattered. But respite was not resolution. The empathic link had not just shared pain, it had transmitted purpose. Ilara's consciousness, a tapestry woven from torment, showed him the flaw's architecture. The cataclysm had not been a random failure. It was the violent awakening of a deeper, older consciousness that the dark elves' power, the first shadow, had inadvertently parasitized. Their civilization was built on a sleeping god, and their final perfect glyph had been a nail driven into its mind. That entity did not sleep now. It dreamed in pain. And its dreams were slowly seeping upward, seeking the air who contained its wrath, seeking the world above. The quiet in the cavern was not peace. It was the held breath before the true storm. To mend anything, they had to wake it fully. They had to descend past the route into the dreaming dark below and confront the source. It was suicide. It was the only possible path to a legacy beyond ruin. Alaric's body protested every movement. The translucent wound in his shoulder burned with phantom cold. The gash in his side wept steadily. His pierced hand was a useless, throbbing claw. Yet he stood, met Alara's gaze and nodded, a human gesture absurd in this cavern of cosmic pain. The heir could not leave their throne, but they could guide. Alara's eyes closed. The silver strand of hair in the locket, still clutched in Alaric's good hand, grew warm. It tugged in not laterally, but down. The polished cavern floor at the very base of the root, where Alaric's blood had pooled, began to change. The stone, a mosaic of conflicting energies, started to flow like dark water, swirling into a vortex that revealed not rock, but a passage leading into impenetrable blackness. A throat opening into the deep below. This was the descent no dark elf had ever made. This was the plunge into the mind of the wounded thing they had built upon. Alaric stepped into the vortex. The stone did not feel solid. It felt viscous, yielding, and alive. He was swallowed by the world's flesh. The descent was a suffocating pressure, a slide through geological strata that pulsed with a slow, sick heartbeat. The air vanished, replaced by a thick, mineral-rich fluid that filled his lungs not with oxygen but with visions. He saw the entity's dream. It was not a creature of malice, but of vast, indifferent consciousness. A being of pure, chthonic force, the substrate of reality in this domain. The Dark Elves' first shadow had been a splinter of its power, harnessed and twisted into a cage of symbols. Their city had been a beautiful scab on a living wound. Their unmaking had been the entity's reflexive jerk in its sleep, a neural spasm that had annihilated the irritation. Now, it dreamed of that irritation, and in the dream, it was stirring. Alaric was expelled from the passage onto a shelf of rough, porous stone. He vomited the vision fluid onto the ground, his body convulsing. He was in a chamber that had no right to exist. It was the underside of reality. Above him, the intricate, glowing web of the world root was visible like a luminous ceiling. Below, there was only a vast, black emptiness. And in that emptiness, something shifted. It was not a shape, it was a presence. A mountain of sentient shadow so vast it defied perspective. This was the sleeper, the first shadow's source. And it was turning its attention upward, toward the pinprick of pain that was Alara, toward the new, buzzing irritation that was Alaric. The drama was one of scale, and blood was its catalyst. Alaric's mere presence, his dripping, hybridized blood falling from the shelf into the abyss, was a clarion call in the dream. The entity's shifting became a focused intention. Tendrils of pure anti-light, darker than the surrounding void, began to coalesce and rise from the depths. They were not limbs, but manifestations of will, seeking the source of the disturbance. One tendril, swift as a striking serpent, lashed against the shelf. Where it touched, the stone didn't crumble. It unformed, reverting to primordial slurry. Another whipped toward Alaric. He had no weapon, no defense. He raised the only thing he had, the locket. The tendril contacted the fused symbol of sun and shadow. For a moment, the conflicting energies within the locket flared, creating a dissonant shriek in the fabric of the dream. The tendril recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion. The entity's dream mind could not process this symbol. It was an equation that had no solution in its logic. But the locket's power was finite, a spark against an ocean. More tendrils rose. The entity was fully awakening now, its vast mind turning over, bringing the full weight of its dreaming wrath to bear. The chamber trembled. Pieces of the ceiling, the root itself, began to crack and shear away, raining luminous debris into the dark. Alaric realized the horrific truth. To awaken it was not to rouse it to conversation, it was to trigger its full, reflexive purge. They were not descending to negotiate. They were descending to pull the trigger on the world's immune system. His blood, his life, was the infection. And the entity would cleanse it, and everything connected to it, including Alara, including the root, perhaps including the world above. He had reached the end. The awakening below was not a beginning, it was the end of all things. The deep dark was opening its eyes, and it saw them as nothing but a fever to be broken. The final choice was upon him, to be dissolved into the dreaming dark, or to become the vessel for a last, desperate shout back at the throne above. Dissolution. That was the entity's solution. To unmake the anomaly, the infection, the dreaming irritation that was Alaric's life. Tendrils of anti-light rose around him, a forest of erasure. The locket's defiant spark was guttering, its power nearly spent against the waking behemoth of the deep. Above, the world root groaned, shedding great crystalline shards into the abyss. The purge had begun. But in the face of absolute impersonal annihilation, a singularly human thought ignited in Alaric's ravaged mind. He was not just an infection, he was a scholar. And a scholar's purpose was not to fight or to flee, but to interpret. To find meaning in the chaos, the Dark Elves had misunderstood. They saw the entity's power, the first shadow, as a tool to be harnessed, a foundation to build upon. They had built a glorious, parasitic civilization on a living god. Their legacy was one of theft, culminating in cataclysm. To mend that legacy was not to fight the god, nor to beg its mercy. It was to offer a correction. A translation. His body was failing, but his mind, honed by obsession and empathy, burned with a final lucid fire. He looked at the tendrils not as weapons, but as text. They were the entity's language, its raw, undifferentiated expression of self. The Dark Elves had tried to carve that language into glyphs of control. That was their first and fatal error. You could not command a god. you could only apologize. You could only acknowledge the debt. Blood was the only ink that mattered here. With his last strength, Alaric did not raise the locket in defense. Instead, he slammed it down onto the porous stone of the shelf. The crystal and obsidian halves shattered. The silver strand of Alara's hair freed, coiled in the air for a moment, before settling into the pool of Alaric's own blood. He then did what no dark elf had ever done, turned the ritual dagger on himself, not for power, but for penitence. Ignoring the rising tendrils, he placed the blade's point against the center of the most prominent blood glyph on his forearm, the first glyph, the symbol of theft. With a grunt of agony, he began to cut, not to trace it, but to scarify it, to cut it out of his flesh. He sawed through skin and sinew, his blood flowing not in ritual trickles, but in a hot, liberating gush, mingling with Alara's hair and the shards of the broken covenant. His blood was no longer just his. It was a mixture, his own human vitality, the whisper taint of the dark elves from the glyphs, the lingering gold from the root's wound. It was a synthesis, a new ink. As the tendrils closed in, their anti-light beginning to dissolve the very air around him, Alaric used his fingers, dipped in this hybrid blood, and began to draw on the stone shelf. But he did not draw the first glyph, he drew its inverse. Where the glyph was angular and assertive, his mark was receptive, curved. Where it sought to channel, this mark sought to accept. It was not a symbol of control, but of understanding, of apology. He was writing a receipt for a stolen power, acknowledging the debt in the only currency he had left, his life freely given. The effect was not explosive. It was a sudden, profound stillness. The nearest tendril stopped, its tip inches from his face. The vast, shifting presence in the abyss paused. The chaotic dream mind, capable only of reflexive purge or deep sleep, encountered a new concept, voluntary offering. It sensed the blood, not as an invading irritant, but as a returned sacrament. It sensed the shattered covenant not as a weapon, but as a released constraint. It sensed through the empathic bridge still tenuously linked to Alara, the heir's eternal, willing sacrifice. The entity did not understand compassion, but it understood balance. A theft, millennia old, was being repaid. Not in full, that was impossible, but in earnest, with interest of pain. The tendrils did not withdraw. They gently enveloped Alaric. The anti-light did not dissolve him. It examined him. It read the story in his blood, in his dying mind, in the scarified glyph on his arm. It saw the unmaking of the city, the torment of the air, the long, painful journey of this fragile mortal to this point of offering. In the throne cavern above, Alara felt it. The spears of power transfixing them did not vanish, but their corrosive burn changed. The feedback loop softened, not into nothingness, but into a sustainable flow. The entity was not purging, it was integrating, accepting the air as a part of itself, a conscious filter, rather than a foreign object to be expelled. The mending was not a repair, it was a reconciliation. The broken legacy of the Dark Elves, the legacy of theft and arrogance, was being overwritten by a new legacy written in Alaric's blood. One of acknowledgement, sacrifice, and the bearing of witness. Down in the deep, Alaric's work was done. His blood mark was complete. The entity's attention shifted away from him, turning its vast consciousness toward the new equilibrium with Alara. The pressure lifted. The dream changed. Alaric lay on the shelf, emptied. He was not dissolved, but he was spent, a dry vessel. He had translated the final, most important text, the meaning of their suffering. And in doing so, he had purchased not a victory, but a chance. A fragile, bleeding chance for something new to grow from the ashes and the silence. He had mended the broken legacy by ending it, and in its place, he had sown a single, precarious seed of peace. The deep dark closed its eyes, not in sleep, but in a state of watchful, balanced rest. The dawn, if it was to come, would now be up to the air. Alaric did not die on the shelf in the deep. He lingered, suspended between the fading pulse of his own heart and the vast, slow rhythm of the newly balanced entity below. His blood had soaked into the porous stone, his final glyph of apology now a permanent dark stain against the rock. He was empty. A spent vessel, a concluded chapter. Above, in the throne cavern, the change was profound. The spears of power piercing Alara did not vanish, but their nature transformed. The searing, chaotic feedback that had been a torrent of agony softened into a steady, manageable current. The silver, gold, and green energies no longer fought for dominance through their flesh. They flowed in a harmonious circuit with Alara as the calm center. The excruciating scream of the throne became a resonant, stable hum. For the first time since the cataclysm, Alara knew peace. Not the absence of pain, but its integration. The entity below was no longer a wounded god lashing out in its sleep. It was a conscious force, and it recognized the air not as a parasite, but as a symbiote. A bridge, a living covenant. Strength, alien and gentle, flowed back down the empathic link to the broken man below. It was not enough to heal Alaric's mortal wounds, but it was enough to stir him, to grant a final ascent. With a groan that echoed in the vast silence, the stone of the shelf shifted, forming a gentle ramp upward, carrying his broken body back toward the root. He emerged into the cavern of the throne not as a conqueror or a supplicant, but as a ghost of himself. He lay at the base of the nexus, looking up at Alara. Their starless gray eyes met his. No words passed between them. None were needed. The debt was clear. He had given his life to mend their torment. They had been granted the peace to now choose a new path. Alara moved. It was a slow, cracking, tectonic motion. They raised a hand, the first voluntary movement in millennia. With deliberate, grinding slowness, they wrapped their fingers around the central spear of silver energy transfixing their chest. It did not come free easily. As they pulled, a fresh cascade of liquid light, like crystallized tears, fell from the wound. But it was not the blood of agony. It was the ichor of release. One by one, with unbearable, majestic slowness, Alara drew the spears of power from their body. Each extraction was a seismic event in the cavern. With each spear removed, the corresponding energy did not rage wild. It gently coiled around Alara's form, weaving into a luminous mantle of silver, gold, and verdant green. They were not dismantling the throne. They were wearing it. When the last spear was drawn, Alara descended. Their feet touched the cavern floor for the first time. The power that had been their prison now cloaked them, a corona of quiet majesty. They stood before Alaric, a monarch of mended realms. They knelt, a godling kneeling to a dying scholar. Alara placed a hand on Alaric's chest, over his failing heart. Their touch was cool and warm at once. The corona of energy around them pulsed, and a single radiant drop, a fusion of all three powers, fell from Alara's fingertip onto Alaric's lips. It was not healing. His wounds did not close. His scarified arm did not mend. He was too far gone for that. This was a transfusion of legacy. He tasted deep earth, cold starlight, and the first green shoot breaking through sun-warmed soil. He saw not an end, but a beginning. The silent city below, its silver veins now pulsing with a soft, steady light. No longer a tomb, but a memorial. The weeping veil still wept, but its tears now cleansed rather than scarred. The world above, untouched, unknowing of the apocalypse, averted beneath its roots. Alaric's breathing eased. The pain did not vanish, but it became distant, unimportant. He had witnessed the dawn. He had translated the final, hopeful word. He looked up at Alara, the heir to a forgotten throne, who now wore its power as a mantle, the first citizen of a new, quiet world. The first dawn in the deep dark. A faint, final smile touched Alaric's blood-crusted lips. His quest was over, his last translation complete. He had come seeking a lost race, and had instead helped birth something new from its ashes. His eyes closed not in death, but in the profound peace of a task finished, his consciousness gently dissolving into the soft, resonant hum of the mended world as the first true light, a light of balance, hard-won and paid. For in blood glowed gently in the eternal dark.